And, we just talked about asthma that started before service but worsened during service can be connected.
Absolutely.
Can you talk about dealing with claims where there's aggravation of a condition of asthma?
Sure. With any medical condition, the VA starts by looking at whether you had the condition before you went into service. It's called a pre-existing condition. If there is a condition that someone says started before service, the VA looks to see what happened when you had your physical examination for entrance into service. And they look to see whether some disabling condition was noted at that time.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Attorney Francis Jackson.
Welcome to Victory Over VA. If you're a veteran struggling with the VA's disability system, or you just want to make sure you're getting the benefits you've earned, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss an update that could change your life. I'm Francis Jackson, here with expert veterans disability attorney Alexandra Jackson. We're both from Jackson and MacNichol. We've helped thousands of veterans just like you win the benefits you deserve. Now, this podcast is not just for veterans navigating the VA's disability system. It's for their families, their friends, and anyone else who wants to stand with those who've served. So stick around, because we're here to make sure you get the support you need. Today's show is about those lovely conditions: asthma, rhinitis, and sinusitis.
Everybody's favorites, right?
Everybody's favorites.
I don't think most people know what rhinitis versus sinusitis is.
Well, I know the answer to that. Rhinitis is the inflammation and swelling of the mucous membranes inside the nose.
Oh, that's so detailed.
So let's launch. What do we got?
Yeah, so the big question for a lot of people is when you're talking about this sort of stuff, asthma, rhinitis, sinusitis, etc., can you get rated for it?
Absolutely, you can. And there are different ratings depending on whether you're talking about asthma or sinusitis or rhinitis. But you can get rated for all of those, and the ratings depend on which one it is and how severe it is.
So I think a lot of people think of asthma as something that you get as a child, along with any of these other kind of, what would you call them, sinus area conditions, sort of allergic related almost. Mm-hmm. How common are those sorts of claims for service connection today?
Asthma conditions are not a big percentage of VA claims, but there are thousands of them.
Is it more common in any particular group of veterans?
Yeah, it's more common with Persian Gulf veterans, especially those with burn pit exposure.
Okay, so we're talking primarily then about asthma that's been induced by toxic exposure. That's mostly what comes up.
Right, but keep in mind that asthma from any source is potentially a VA disability claim. The question is always whether you can show a relationship to service. So even if you're a veteran who had asthma prior to service, you may still be potentially able to show that your time in service aggravated that condition, and you're still entitled to a VA disability rating and payment, even though it's not something that necessarily started in service.
I can't imagine that breathing ash is good for people with asthma, so that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true.
So if we're talking a lot about these burn pit and other kind of weird Gulf War exposures, can you get service connection still even if the asthma started after separation?
Oh yes, as with any VA disability, you have to show that you have the condition, You have to show that something happened in service that potentially led to that condition or aggravated it if you already had it. And you have to show a medical nexus tying those two together, a medical opinion explaining why the current condition was caused by what happened in service, unless it's a presumptive condition.
Can you talk a little bit more about the presumptions? What are there for asthma and breathing issues?
Well, there's not a presumption specifically for asthma. There is a presumption for allergic rhinitis and for sinusitis if folks served in the Persian Gulf. In the right time period, the right area, you have to prove all of that. But otherwise, the presumption takes care of tying the current condition to what happened in service.
Okay. And, we just talked about asthma that started before service but worsened during service can be connected.
Absolutely.
Can you talk about dealing with claims where there's aggravation of a condition of asthma?
Sure. With any medical condition, the VA starts by looking at whether you had the condition before you went into service. It's called a pre-existing condition. If there is a condition that someone says started before service, the VA looks to see what happened when you had your physical examination for entrance into service. And they look to see whether some disabling condition was noted at that time. The fact that you may have had asthma as a kid and had no symptoms by the time you went into the service doesn't mean it's necessarily what the VA would consider a pre-existing condition. But from a legal point of view, generally speaking, if a condition existed prior to service and was not noted at the time you came into the service in your initial physical assessment, then the law assumes that it got worse during service, and the VA has to disprove that fact.
So it's not your problem, it's VA's problem.
In large part.
Okay. And then if a lot of this stuff is related to being in the Gulf and all the crap you got in your body over there, how necessary is it to have documentation specifically of dust storms or being in a motor pool or any of that?
All that depends on exactly where you were and when. There are very specific rules for who the presumption applies to, and you'd have to look at where the veteran was stationed and at what period of time. But for certain veterans, there are specific presumptions that they were exposed to burn pits and the like, and that is the cause of either sinusitis or rhinitis. For asthma, there's no presumption, so you just have to prove whatever it is you think caused it, whether it was dust storms or exposure to burn pits or whatever else.
Okay. And talking about linked items, are any of these potentially caused by other service-connected conditions?
Well, I'm not medical expert enough to discuss that generically, but there seems to be a close connection between sinusitis and rhinitis. If you have sinusitis, which is infection of the sinuses in the head, that often seems to coexist with rhinitis, which is the inflammation of the mucus inside the nose. Probably because the same things, probably because the same things set it off. But I'm not expert enough medically to tell you exactly why those tend to coexist.
Have you seen any common secondary conditions that come from asthma or rhinitis or sinusitis that should keep in mind and claim?
The one that seems to be pretty common with asthma is COPD, and I think that's one of those chicken and egg problems. Does the COPD cause the asthma? Does the asthma cause the COPD? I don't know. Yeah. But they tend to show up together a lot.
Is pulmonary testing particularly important with things like this?
Pulmonary testing is required by the VA to prove service connection for any asthma. And the way they rate the asthma, if you have occasional symptoms and have to use occasionally a medical inhaler or bronchodilator, then 10%. as the rating. If it's mild to moderate and you have to use daily inhalers or anti-inflammatory medication, then it's 30% rating. It goes to 60% if it's bad enough that you have to go to the doctor every month, or you have to use high-dose corticosteroids or immunosuppressants 3 or more times a year. And finally, if it's so bad that you're frequently hospitalized and you have to use high-dose corticosteroids or immunosuppressants daily, then it goes to 100%. Those are the ratings.
It sounds deeply unpleasant, so I can imagine why it's at 100%.
Yeah, I
What?
mean, if you're frequently hospitalized, obviously you're probably not going to be able to work.
No. What do you do if it's kind of borderline, your symptoms? Whereas, I mean, the rating codes are all very mechanical, right?
They are.
But you mentioned you're at the doctor every month. What if you're at the doctor every other month?
Well, the VA really looks primarily at the pulmonary function tests.
Okay.
And the descriptions I gave you are intended to be descriptive, but there are specific values on the pulmonary function tests that go into the 10, 30, 60, and 100 ratings.
Which you can read but don't sound very interesting if you just read them out.
Yeah, I mean, how many people really care what your forced expiratory volume is?
Yeah.
In the FEV -1 formula.
No.
I mean, unless you're a pulmonologist, those numbers don't have any meaning to people.
I don't even know the prescription for my reading glasses, guys. I look at it and it's gobbledygook to me. I just hand it over.
The short version is that high FEV ones are good, low FEV ones are bad, and where you fall on the rating depends on how far yours has fallen.
Oh, how thrilling. What are the most common reasons that these types of claims get denied?
Well, with asthma, the most common reasons are that the VA hasn't been convinced that something in service caused it, or you, despite having some asthma, still have a pretty good FEV1, meaning your lungs still hold a reasonable amount of volume of air. With sinusitis and rhinitis, those mostly turn on whether you're eligible for the presumption or not. There are not a huge amount of those claims outside of the folks who served in the Persian Gulf. I mean, it's not impossible to see those claims among other groups. Folks that were exposed to Agent Orange, for example, you see it occasionally, but mostly not. So those cases tend to mostly involve the presumptions, and the work on the claims tends to be about what the proper rating is.
Now, we mentioned that it's kind of VA's problem, quote unquote, if you had asthma and it gets worse. But is that something they mess up?
Oh, all the time. But what the VA often does is they will say, this is a pre-existing condition and therefore we're denying it. They hardly ever, at the initial steps, recognize that as long as you did not have the condition noted at the time you entered into service, that it's actually their obligation to disprove it. Or what they'll do is they'll get a letter from or a report from some doctor on a CMP exam that says, Jones had asthma before he or she entered service, and therefore it's a pre-existing condition and it wasn't aggravated by service. And they'll deny the claim. When in fact, there's an incredibly high standard of proof that the VA can hardly ever meet. They have to show by clear and convincing evidence that the condition was not aggravated during service. And the court has made clear that that's a very, very difficult burden of proof. I had a case once where one doctor said, clearly this is from his pre-existing condition. It wasn't asthma, but there was a doctor.
Same logic.
There was a doctor in CMP, definitely pre-existing. Definitely, there's clear and convincing evidence that it didn't get worse in service. And another doctor who said, baloney, this clearly got worse in service. The court said, look, there are conflicting opinions on this issue. Therefore, it cannot be clear and convincing evidence. Therefore, the veteran wins.
So basically, if there can be a difference of opinion about it, that is not clear and convincing.
That's where the court has pretty consistently gone, yes.
Fair enough. I'd say it's not very convincing if people have different opinions.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Where you have cases where it feels like the VA is underrating these sorts of breathing conditions, the severity of them, how do you challenge that?
Well, you have to do it by appeal, just like any other challenge to a VA decision. But with asthma, that one's pretty mechanical. You pretty much have to show that the pulmonary function tests are really bad, or the doctor has to really give an extremely detailed explanation for why other elements of the asthma are so bad that the VA should give it the higher rating, even though the PFTs are still within the lower rating. And that's rare, but that one's pretty mechanical. Now with the sinusitis and rhinitis, those are trickier. The VA can rate sinusitis anywhere from 10% to 50%. And generally speaking, the way they do it with the sinusitis, if there are only a couple of incapacitating episodes a year requiring 4 to 6 weeks of antibiotic treatment, or,
4 to 6 weeks of antibiotics multiple times a year?
4 to 6 weeks, a couple times a year, 1 or 2, yep.
That's a lot of your year.
It is. The VA says that's not enough to put you out of work or really seriously incapacitate you, so 10%. If you get up to three, if you get up to 3 of those episodes that are incapacitating, or half a dozen non-incapacitating episodes, then 30%. And if you get to the point where you have to have repeated surgeries, or you have essentially constant symptoms with headaches and pain and discharge, then they'll go up to 50%. And with the rhinitis, they rate that under several different diagnostic codes. So the ratings change a little, but essentially it turns on the degree to which your ability to breathe through your nose is compromised. So if you have polyps or nasal deviation that closes off one side of the nose, it's a question of how high. So 10% if there aren't any polyps, but there's more than 50% obstruction of the nasal passages, or total obstruction of one side, and then 30% if there are polyps present at all, and 50% if there are essentially nearly constant symptoms.
This is starting to sound like the VA's amputation rule. If you'd be better off without your nose.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
I mean, you understand that the VA is trying to make objective gradations for things that really
for suffering,
aren't,
yes.
can't be objectified. So
Yeah.
it's a challenge.
So what's your advice for a veteran who's had breathing issues for years but was told it was just allergies or it's not serious enough to file?
Well, my suggestion would be get a copy of the rating codes. You can go online and get them. Take them to your allergist or your family physician and say, look at these and tell me what you think. Assuming that the doctor thinks that it's serious enough to qualify for at least a 10% rating under one of the relevant diagnostic codes, then you can go and file the claim and get into the whole issue with the VA about whether you can prove this ties back to service.
Fair enough.
That's my advice. And folks, with that, we're going to wrap up today's show, and we hope to see you next week.
Thank you for joining us for Victory Over VA.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.